Hey everybody, welcome to Unit 2. This is topic 1 of another 7 topic unit. In this case, we're moving on from sort of the general patterns that we established in Unit 1 and looking at more of the breadth of the UN. That's why this topic is cleverly called the breadth of the UN. There's some caveats to this, but what we're really talking about is just the wide scope of what the UN does, and that doesn't mean just what the current agencies are, because as you've seen from when we looked at the UN Charter, the Charter from 1945, there's only a few things specifically listed in there in terms of organizations that will be present. But we know that there's a lot more than that come over time. So, similar to that, we'll have a whole bunch of agencies that come from now into the future that we don't really know what those will be. For example, one of the major topics at the UN over the last 3 years, it wasn't major 3 years ago, it was a pretty big conversation though in the fall of 2017, is killer robots. Wow, killer robots doesn't sound like a topic that the UN would be dealing with, but because that's become a thing, lethal autonomous weapon systems, you may soon see an organization dedicated to that that's part of the UN. So we have no idea what's coming. Certainly we wouldn't have guessed in 45 that killer robots would be a topic, or in 65 or 85 or 2005, but 2015 it was. So that's what we're going to look at here when we look at the breadth of the UN, and off we go. All right, so let's switch to the next slide here. We're going to revisit the UN organizational chart. Again, not to emphasize anything particularly, just to revisit it. So, if you would recall, this structure down along the left here is what was part and parcel of the UN in the charter itself in 45, and you have all of these different organizations. But what I really want to talk about are the caveats first. So, the caveats being domestic jurisdiction. So hopefully all of you took advantage of my offer at the end of the UN Charter assignment to have a cheat sheet sent on to you that would have helped you at the end of Unit 1. It would help you now too, because one of the caveats, there's three, one of the caveats as part of the UN Charter is that domestic jurisdiction supersedes the authority of the United Nations. So this means two things primarily. First, it means that if the UN wants to do something in your country, it needs to ask permission. So that's anything. That's from promoting education. That's from doing clean water projects. Those are partnerships that are done with the countries, even to the point in most situations where if the UN wants to have a peacekeeping force in a country, we'll look at peacekeeping here in this unit. If a peacekeeping force, typically it needs to ask permission of the member states to have that force present in the country. So that's the first thing it means. The second thing it means is that almost all of the UN treaties are focused on some sort of international composition of the topic. For example, I have here on the screen a picture of some elephants and then a logo of a UN organization. So elephants themselves are not protected by the United Nations or by any agreement that's in the United Nations. There are several agencies that seek to protect elephants, but there's no binding thing that any state says they will do vis-a-vis elephants within their own country. However, there is this other organization. It's called the CITES or CITES Treaty. It's the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species. So I've highlighted there the I and the T part of that. That's international trade. So there are major international agreements and annual conferences to protect against the international trade in endangered species. So even though this is a picture of some elephants in Botswana, the Botswanans can do pretty much whatever they want with their own elephant population. They're not allowed to trade them or trade the products from them openly because of their participation in the CITES agreement. Okay, so it's a difference between endangered species and the trade in endangered species. Similar to that is a major treaty that's from the last 5 years. It's called the Arms Trade Treaty, which led to a lot of consternation in the United States on the part of people who thought that it might be an attempt to an end around by the Obama administration to participate in an international treaty that would limit access for Americans to have guns. But even in the title, it emphasizes it's the Arms Trade Treaty. What it's trying to protect was the unregulated trade of small arms and light weapons, SALW, which is a major issue in terms of fueling conflict around the world. So it wasn't an arms treaty, one that was limited about your domestic arms market. It was about certain kinds of trade in arms, the Arms Trade Treaty. So keep that in mind. The domestic jurisdiction, either the UN has to be invited in so that you can partner on things. They're not going to force you to do much because the charter has that caveat of domestic jurisdiction. And typically speaking, when you have major international treaties, they tend to impact some international component of things. Now, that's not exhaustive. There are some other issues where it's domestic, but again, you have to agree to participate, such as in how you treat children, how you treat women, how you treat other marginalized groups. So, if we're going to have domestic jurisdiction, it helps to understand what we mean by domestic borders. So, one of the things that the UN helps establish is exactly what a domestic border looks like. And you may think you know what the borders of your country are, the country that you're in, what the United States looks like, but it's actually a little bit more complicated than that because we have more than just terrestrial or land borders. So there's a series of agreements through UN or UN affiliated organizations which help determine things. This is a picture from a city I used to live in a place called the Azores. The Azores are a Portuguese province. They are roughly a third of the way between the European mainland and the U.S. East Coast. And one of the islands is called Terceira, and on Terceira is a city called Angra do Heroísmo, or Heroism Bay. There's a fort there. This is a picture of the fort. So a fort used to determine how much of the ocean you could control if you had sea territory. There was a rule of thumb from early 1700s on that was called the cannon shot rule. So roughly you got 3 miles off your coast that counted as your territory because that was how far you could effectively control. The cannon shot determined your territory. It didn't do much good to claim 4 miles if you couldn't control it. So that was it. But as you got to modern weapons, larger cannons, cruise missiles, and things that can go thousands of miles, that doesn't become practical anymore. So one of the things the UN helps determine through the UN Convention on the Laws of the Sea is how much maritime territory you get to do different kinds of things. There's a 12 nautical mile measure, there's a 24 nautical mile measure, there's a 200 nautical mile measure. There's all these things that determine what is yours and what you can do in the different spots. Similarly, there's the International Civil Aviation Organization, the ICAO, which determines how much airspace you get, which sometimes parallels what you have with maritime borders, but then has some overlapping issues elsewhere as well, and also determines other things you can do. We're just talking about what territory you control. So one of the things they try to determine is how high airspace goes, and that's not an answered question. It used to be similar to the cannon shot rule. If you could shoot somebody down, then they were in your airspace. But as you are able to put satellites and other things up, that changes the game. So if we don't know where that space ends, then maybe outer space is an issue, and in a sense, it is. But it comes up with another issue that complicates things. So you have terrestrial, you have maritime, you have air, and then you have these space borders. But that sort of shows a limitation of the UN, which, depending on how you look at it, is a limitation or a breadth issue. So the UN, and through various treaties, has established some parts of the world and the universe as the heritage of all, where the states of the world have agreed to give up claims to certain parts of the globe. For example, Antarctica is considered part of the globe where no country can have a sovereign claim. There's some issues with that. I mean, there's a few countries that had claims when the treaty was reached, and they agreed to sort of set those aside. But they basically designated Antarctica as a place where for the heritage of all. Same thing with the high seas and the deep oceans. Those are the heritage of all. And that's essentially what they've done with space and celestial bodies, is say that's a place for the heritage of all. It's a way you get different kinds of countries on board, even though they don't, for example, have access to Antarctica, or they aren't capable of mining the deep oceans or of sending satellites into space. So that's depending on how you look at it, that either expands the breadth of the UN to say this is part of everyone's heritage, or it's a limitation. And I don't have a good answer for you on that, so I'll let you figure it out as you wish. But that concept of maybe outer space being something that is for the heritage of mankind has some practical applications. I was doing an activity in class on campus not too long ago where we were debating and discussing what countries were of most interest for students to study, and they were talking about their own interests combined with what the countries were capable of. And so we're looking at Pacific Island states, and one of the students mentioned that he was most interested in outer space. Therefore, the Pacific Island states really had held nothing for him because they were not going to be in space anytime soon. And that's true, except the UN Office on Outer Space Affairs, or UNOOSA, it's got two O's in it, it's a weird one to say, and UN Spider, which is a space-based information for disaster management emergency response, coordinate information that is based in and around satellite technology to maximize them for everyone. This is why, for example, even though GPS navigation systems were developed by the U.S. military and are based initially were based in U.S. satellites, the technology was shared with all. So even if you're in a Pacific state, you still have access to GPS there and to satellite technology. You don't have to launch your own satellites. So this is both practical in terms of getting everyone involved and something that just basically lets states defer the issue till later. For example, let's go back to this previous map. This one shows here at the bottom of the world, or the bottom of the map at least, Antarctica spread out there, and that's part of the heritage of all. So no national claims can be made there, no mining or other economic activities can take place there. That's an easy commitment to make because it's not a place that can be utilized right now until either the climate changes what is possible there or technology changes and you can begin to drill through all that ice and do things. And it's not a problem, for example, to say we're not going to do anything there. Same thing in the deep seas or in outer space. So there's a treaty that says you can't mine celestial bodies. Well, that was well and good when you signed the treaty in the 1960s and 70s. But now with all the different private space companies looking to go out there, it will have to change. There will have to be something different. So the idea of the heritage of all is practical in those two senses. One, it lets states defer the issue because maybe someday they'll have it and now they can share in it. And it was one that is problematic because they're going to come back to us when the ability to take advantage of those situations, those opportunities arises. So outer space, all kinds of interesting things going on in relation to all states, not just spacefaring nations. And that really shows the breadth of the UN. So you're talking about going all the way from the different issues we looked at now also being in outer space for the heritage of mankind. What does this mean practically? Well, it means you've got that org chart with all those different organizations and projects they're working on. It means that even though the domestic jurisdiction supersedes the ability of the UN to go in and force states to do things, by and large, those caveats on the Security Council if the UN feels the need to act there. But by and large, all those things that the UN is up to are done in the partnership through domestic jurisdiction. And it means that all kinds of things may yet happen as you develop. So you've got that takeaway there. The UN sphere of influence extends to unlikely areas, but it's also limited. So whether you think it's super broad or one that doesn't have a wide enough reach is something for you to determine. But the number of issues that are ongoing there are as broad as you can imagine. I have given you a link, an optional link to follow in the Unit 2 Topic 1 folder. It's the agenda for the General Assembly for the 2017-2018 meeting year. It's the 72nd session of the General Assembly. So you can just open that and scroll through and see the kinds of things they're talking about. Some are peace and security, some are development, some are human rights, but a lot are things that you might not think were being discussed by the General Assembly. So lots going on and lots more will be going on, including things that we can't even imagine what they might be yet.